The moment the elevator doors opened onto the 38th floor, Beatrix felt it. Not the cold exactly. The hotel's event spaces were always over-air-conditioned in July, but the particular quality of silence that descends on a room the instant someone walks in who wasn't expected. She'd spent an hour getting ready at the condo, pressed the gray dress Ronan had once called elegant, caught the 6:15 subway to King Street because parking downtown on a Thursday was impossible. She'd even been a little excited quietly, the way you get excited about small things that have been withheld for a long time. Ronan had given her excuse after excuse over the years. +1 limits, seating charts, you'd find it boring, Bea. And tonight he'd finally sent a text that said, dinner starts at 7. I saved you a seat. She hadn't asked herself why he'd changed his mind. She should have. The room was long and amber lit, filled with Vantage Design Group's best and brightest gathered for their annual achievement dinner. 40, maybe 50 people. Good wine and oysters and the low thrum of conversation that is the particular sound of architects who've had a successful year. She walked past the bar, past a cluster of junior staff she didn't recognize, and found the center table, the one near the windows overlooking the lake. Ronan was there. Of course he was, but so was Portia Langley beside him in a way that wasn't just beside him, her shoulder touching his, her hand resting close to his on the tablecloth, the particular angle of her body, turned toward him, easy and unhurried, that said this was not a professional posture and hadn't been for some time. Conversations around them stuttered, recovered, found their footing again. But Beatrix had seen Aldous Birch, Ronan's senior partner, look at her and then look away and then take a very long deliberate sip of his wine. She understood then, not with her mind, not yet, but with the older, more honest part of her that had been trying to tell her something for months. Ronan spotted her and stood slowly. His face did something complicated, not guilt exactly, more the expression of a man who had miscalculated a timeline and was adjusting in real time. "Bah, I wasn't sure you'd make it with the rain." "The text said 7, she said. "There was a schedule change. I was going to message you." He reached for his phone. "Don't," she said quietly. She looked at Portia. Portia looked back at her without flinching. She had the composure of someone who had decided at some earlier point that she had nothing to be ashamed of. "How long?" Beatrix asked. She wasn't sure who she was asking. Ronan was silent. 18 months, Portia said. Clear and direct, as if it were a straightforward answer to a straightforward question. 18 months. Beatrix ran backward through 18 months the way you thumb through a book looking for a page you missed. Christmas in Ottawa with Ronan's family. The long weekend in Muskoka where he'd been distracted and she'd blamed the workload. The Tuesday in February when he'd been unexpectedly tender with her, and she'd thought quietly that maybe they were finding their way back to something. She stopped running the calculation. "Does everyone here know?" She said it to the room, not to any one person. A few people became very interested in their tablecloths. Aldous set down his wine. 2 women near the bar exchanged a glance that settled the question. "They," Ronan said, dropping into his damage control voice, the one she recognized from difficult client calls, measured and slightly deliberate. "Let's not do this here." "I'm not doing anything," she said. And she meant it. She wasn't going to cry in front of Vantage's senior staff. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to give anyone a story they could tell each other over lunch on Monday. She picked up her clutch from where she'd set it on the table. "File the papers whenever you're ready," she told Ronan. "I won't make it difficult." She walked back to the elevator at the pace of a woman who had somewhere better to be. She did not hurry. She did not turn around. The doors closed. In the mirrored panel she could see herself. Gray dress, damp shoes, an expression that wasn't sadness or fury but something quieter and more settled. She took out her phone. Inez picked up on the second ring. "The Thompson waterfront site," Beatrix said. "Move forward on everything we discussed. And don't pull Vantage from the shortlist. I want to see the full presentation." A pause. Inez had been her chief of staff for 4 years and understood subtext the way other people understood grammar. "Are you all right?" "I will be," Beatrix said. "It'll just take a moment to become true." She had built Greystone Analytics in a studio apartment in Kitchener at 27, working on a laptop with a cracked hinge, running on coffee and the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told once too often that she's thinking too small. The idea was not complicated. Commercial real estate in Canada ran on old relationships, proprietary data kept in silos and valuations that were often 6 months behind reality. Beatrix built a platform that aggregated everything. zoning applications, permit filings, vacancy indices, transit proximity scores, institutional ownership patterns, and ran predictive models that institutionalists actually wanted to use. Reliable, updated daily, built to scale. She pitched to 11 firms before anyone took a serious meeting. She remembered the number exactly because she'd written it in the margin of her original business plan, with a ballpoint pen that kept skipping. By the time she met Ronan at a mutual friend's dinner in Toronto, she'd been running Greystone for 2 years, and the numbers had become genuinely extraordinary. Though she hadn't told anyone outside her investors in Inus, Ronan was funny and attentive and curious about her, in the way that people are when they're trying to make a good impression. And she'd found it lovely. On their third date she tried to explain the valuation model. She'd been excited about a refinement she'd just built into the algorithm. The kind of small technical improvement that has outsized practical consequences. And he'd laughed warmly but easily and said, "Bae, not everyone needs to know the algorithm," and changed the subject. She told herself it didn't matter. That you didn't need your partner to understand the architecture of your work. That plenty of strong relationships had separate professional worlds. She stopped explaining after that. She sold Greystone to a Bay Street firm for $620 million in the spring of the year they got married. She didn't tell Ronan the amount. She said it was a good exit and that she was taking some time. He said that sounded relaxing and booked them a trip to Portugal. When they came back, she watched him upgrade the firm's office space and say nothing about where the money to afford their new neighborhood had come from. And she understood that he had made a comfortable assumption and preferred it to a real conversation. 3 years ago, she'd bought back a controlling stake through a numbered company, restructured the leadership, and relaunched Greystone as a fully private entity. The press release named Silvana Reyes as chief executive. Beatrix held the title of managing director, Greystone Holdings, a designation that appeared in no announcement, no profile, no public-facing document of any kind. She'd told herself she was being discreet, strategic, keeping her professional life quiet the way serious people sometimes did. She was beginning to understand what she'd actually been doing. The divorce papers arrived 11 days after the hotel dinner, delivered by courier in a thick envelope that Ronan's lawyer had assembled with evident thoroughness. The condo, the car, a division of the joint account. On the line for Beatrix's financial disclosures, someone had written independent consulting, estimated $80,000 annually. $80,000. She had made that in interest last week. She sat at the kitchen table she'd chosen and the chairs she'd reupholstered herself one long weekend in January, and she read through every clause. Then she signed every page without contesting a single one. The furniture, the kitchen renovation she'd done by hand, the print she'd brought back from a trip to Montreal the year before they met, all of it. Let him have it. She wanted a clean line between the life that was ending and whatever came next. The new condo was already waiting. She'd bought it 6 weeks earlier, before the dinner, before she'd known why she needed it. She'd simply been ready for more space and hadn't understood yet how correct that instinct would prove. Harborfront, lake view, floor-to-ceiling windows that filled with pale northern light in the mornings. She moved in over a single weekend with 2 hired movers, and nothing from the old condo except her clothes, her grandmother's dishes, and the cracked hinge laptop she'd kept as a kind of talisman. Ronan called 40 minutes after the courier picked up the documents. "You signed already." "I did." A silence. "Just like that?" "Just like that." "Where are you going to go?" "I've found a place." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him trying to understand the absence of a fight. He'd been braced for lawyers, or tears, or at minimum a long and difficult phone call. "The consulting income I listed," he said carefully. "I know it's approximate if you want to contest." "It's fine," she said. "It doesn't reflect what matters." She meant it, though not the way he heard it. "Goodbye, Ronan," she said, and hung up before he could find the next thing to say. 3 weeks later, Ines called. The shortlist for the Thompson waterfront project came back. "You'll want to sit down." "I am sitting down." Vantage Design Group is one of 4 finalists. Ronan Caldwell is listed as lead architect. Pause. Their proposal is strong. The design team apparently spent 4 months on it. "Do you want me to pull them?" Beatrix was at her desk in the new condo, reviewing Q3 projections, a mug of tea going cold at her elbow. She looked out at the lake through the new windows. "No," she said. "Standard due diligence on all 4 firms, full financial and conduct review. I want to see everything." The due diligence took 10 days. 3 firms came back clean. A fourth had a liability issue that removed them from consideration the same afternoon the report landed. Vantage's file was more layered. The financial review flagged an irregularity in Portia Langley's expense claims. 22 months of small amounts, none individually suspicious, totaling just over $14,000 billed to a client account. The previous managing partner had signed off on each claim without review. The current oversight committee had no record of ever examining the pattern. There was something else. Ronan had submitted written personal references for Portia to 2 competing firms in the past year, letters forwarded from his official Vantage email, positioning her for senior roles she hadn't publicly applied for. Taken together, the picture was legible. Someone had been quietly building an exit path for someone else in advance, before the timing of everything else made it necessary. Beatrix read the report twice. She felt no satisfaction in any of it. She felt tired, briefly, and then something more solid underneath the tiredness, a clarity that had been arriving in small increments for weeks, like light filling a room so gradually you don't notice it until you realize you can see perfectly. She called Ines. Keep Vantage in the final 2. Narrow to them and the Halifax firm. I'll be in the presentation room. My name stays out of the pre-meeting materials. The 14th of October was overcast and flat, one of those Toronto autumn days that withholds its light entirely. Beatrix wore the navy suit from Vancouver, tailored, quiet, authoritative without announcing itself. She was already seated when the Vantage team came through the door. 4 of them, 2 junior architects she'd never seen, Aldous Birch and Ronan. He was talking to one of the juniors about something in a low, focused voice, carrying a portfolio case, not yet looking at the room. Then he looked at the room. The moment had a particular quality that Beatrix would remember afterward. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but very still, like a held breath. She said, "Good morning, thank you for coming. Please, set up however you need." She watched him decide. She could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, his options, his constraints, his team watching him and needing him to be steady. He set up the presentation. And then he delivered it, because he was a professional, and the work was genuinely excellent, and walking out would have been worse than anything else available to him. For 40 minutes he walked them through the design with precision and care. The way the building met the waterfront, the proportions of the public courtyard, the material choices that would age well in a lakefront climate. Beatrix had read the proposal twice. Seeing it presented was different. The building was beautiful, he was gifted at this. When he finished, the room was quiet. "Thank you," Beatrix said. "The design responds to the site in a way we found genuinely compelling." She opened the folder in front of her. "Before we move to next steps, I need to raise something that came to light during our due diligence review. There are billing irregularities in the expense reports attributed to your proposed project lead, Portia Langley, a pattern over 22 months that appears not to have been formally reviewed. As the client, we're required to address this before proceeding." Aldous went rigid across the table. Ronan said nothing. "This doesn't disqualify the proposal," Beatrix continued. "The design stands completely on its own, but will require confirmation of a formal oversight review and clarity on the project lead before we can sign." The meeting closed with professional language and handshakes and the understanding that written next steps would follow. Aldous and the junior staff filed out. Ronan did not. The door closed, the room held its quiet. He said, "You own Greystone." "I do." "Since when?" "I relaunched it 3 years ago through a holding company, but I built it before we met." He sat down across from her. He had the look of a man trying to reconstruct something from memory that turned out to be completely different from what he'd been picturing. "Why didn't you tell me?" She had turned this question over for weeks. She had a real answer now. "There was a Saturday evening. We'd been married about 2 years. I'd been working all week on a new component of the valuation model, something I was genuinely excited about, the kind of problem you work on for a long time and then suddenly it clicks. I was trying to explain it to you at dinner." She paused. "You said not everyone needs to know the algorithm," and moved on to something else. He was quiet. "You remember saying it," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I remember." "After that I stopped trying." She looked at him evenly. "It wasn't about the algorithm, it was about whether you were actually curious about me, and you weren't, not that part of me, so I made that part smaller, kept it somewhere you wouldn't notice and find it inconvenient." Barasane eyed. "I'm not asking for an apology," she said. "I'm explaining how it happened." She closed the folder. "Greystone will make a decision on the contract within 10 days. Your team's proposal is the strongest we reviewed. That matters." He stood at the door. He stopped, his hand on the frame. What happens to Portia? That's between Vantage and its oversight committee. We've documented what we found and shared it with Aldous. What your firm does with it is your firm's decision. She gathered the folder from the table. I'm not interested in destroying anyone, Ronan. I'm interested in the truth being on the record. There's a difference. Greystone awarded the Thompson waterfront contract to Vantage Design Group 8 days later. The letter specified 2 conditions: that the billing irregularities undergo a formal internal review, and that a revised project lead be confirmed within 30 days. Portia Langley left Vantage before the review concluded. Ronan's status was adjusted to a consultant role on the Thompson file, standard practice for a documented conflict of interest, handled quietly, no announcement made and none needed. A senior project manager became the primary client contact. The transition took 3 days and no one outside the relevant parties had any reason to notice. The building broke ground the following April. From the window of her harborfront condo, on clear mornings, Beatrix could just make out the construction cranes along the waterfront. She keynoted a PropTech conference in Calgary that November, speaking about AI-driven commercial valuation and the future of institutional real estate data in Canada. The session ran 20 minutes over because no one wanted the questions to stop. Afterward, a fund manager from Winnipeg pressed her card into Beatrix's hand and said, "I've been watching Greystone for 2 years. I had absolutely no idea you were behind it." Most people didn't, Beatrix said. She smiled, not for effect, just honestly. That was my mistake. She ran into Ronan at a reception in the spring, at the Royal Ontario Museum for a Canadian Architecture Award. He was with colleagues, looking collected and present, the version of himself she'd first found charming and which, she could see now, existed alongside other versions she'd taken longer to notice. He told her the Thompson project was ahead of schedule, that the firm had brought in an independent oversight coordinator after the internal review. Aldis's idea, and a good one. "I've been working through some things," he said, "with someone." He said it simply, without any bid attached to it. It had the plain sound of someone reporting a true fact about themselves. "I'm glad," Beatrix said, and she was, not for her sake but because it was the only way any of it would eventually mean something. She raised her glass briefly and moved on through the great hall, past the enormous blue whale suspended from the ceiling in its long permanent arc, and found someone she'd been wanting to speak to. A developer she'd been circling professionally for months. Someone serious and thoughtful who had ideas that intersected with what Greystone was building next. She crossed the room to introduce herself, the way she'd been practicing lately, directly, without softening the edges, without making herself smaller to fit the available space. She had always been this person. She'd simply spent too long filing the best parts of herself quietly away, keeping them in accounts with no one else's name on them, waiting for some moment that felt safe enough to matter out loud. The moment, she had learned, was the one you made.